lament. It's not about the world being bad. I think that's what people say. It's like, you're just saying the world is all bad. It's about believing that the world is worthy of goodness, that my neighbor is worthy of goodness. That's where the sadness comes from. And if we shift that, I think those emotions can be experienced as a form of hope.
Hi friends, I'm Amy Julia Becker, and this is Love is Stronger Than Fear, a podcast about pursuing hope and healing in the midst of personal pain and social division. And before I get to today's episode, I do want to let you know that my next book, To Be Made Well, An Invitation to Wholeness, Healing, and Hope, is about to be released. It comes out on March 15th. And for anyone who's listening to this podcast, I just said it, it's a podcast about pursuing hope and healing in the midst of personal pain and social division. That's what this book is about too. So I think you'd really love it. And I would certainly love for you to head over to my website, amyjuliabecker.com, where you can read an excerpt. You can pre-order it. If you pre-order it before March 15th, you should have it on your doorstep on March 15th. And you also can let other people know about it, because I would love for this book to be a part of the healing work that God wants to do in our broken world. All right, on to today's episode. Today I get to talk with Cole Arthur Riley. Cole is the creator of the Black Liturgist on Instagram. She is also the author of the newly released book, This Here Flesh. It's a beautiful book. We are going to be hosting a giveaway for it, so check out the show notes for details. It's really quite something, and I highly recommend it. Cole and I had a chance to talk about what it means to be spiritual creatures who live in bodies, about bearing witness to the pain of the world through our bodies, about the role of anger and sadness in hope, about faith and mystery and contemplation, about the relationship between personal, communal, and social healing. So there's a lot of good stuff ahead, and I'm glad you're here. Well, today you're in for a treat, because I have the privilege of talking with Cole Arthur Riley, and we're going to talk about her beautiful new book, This Here Flesh. I highly recommend it. I'm just going to say that from the top. I hope everyone will read it, honestly, more than once, and spend some good time with it. But before I explain why I think that, I am just going to say, Cole, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I really do want to talk all about your new book today. But before we do that, I feel like I need to introduce the listeners who are here to the work that you do on Instagram. Probably some of them are already well aware of it and others are not. But just to introduce you through this lens, you are also the creator of Black Liturgies. And I thought that rather than having me try to describe what you do in that space, could you just tell us the story of how this account, this Black Liturgies space on Instagram, came to be?
Sure. I began Black Liturgies at the end of June of 2020. So, it was during the period where a lot more people were reckoning with the murders of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd, and the resurfacing of the murders of Breonna Taylor and Elijah McClain. And I had been in liturgical spaces for a while at that point, maybe 5 to 8 years, and have found a lot of comfort in written prayer and contemplative spirituality. But just at that time felt like I was in a lot of Christian spaces that weren't really capable of fielding and understanding my sadness, my anger, in a way that was helpful to me. And I really, when I'm being most honest, I say I started Black Liturgies out of anger. I hope there was some righteous anger in there. But yeah, that's how it began. And I was truly envisioning kind of like this small, intimate little community. I was just laying in bed. I said, I think I'm going to start this thing called Black Liturgies. Maybe there are some other kind of like-minded Black people interested in this kind of thing. And it quickly became a lot bigger than that, which I'm grateful for.
Yes. And so are so many people, including this white person who, reads your words almost daily. But what I will say is I was thinking about the growth of Black liturgies, which is unusual, it seems to me, or surprising to me in a couple of different ways. Like, one, you are unapologetically embracing Blackness
Hmm.
and writing not only from the perspective, obviously, of being a Black woman, but also with a commitment to a spiritual practice, a
Hmm.
commitment to naming truths about our political and historical moment when it comes to race and justice and injustice. And you're also doing it through words on a image based platform. And it's a
Yep.
beautiful, like, you choose your fonts very well, but it's not, there's nothing flashy,
Yep.
or there are no shiny objects. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Which
Yeah,
is, seems to
absolutely.
me is often what we gravitate to on social media. And so the combination of those things to have, I mean, over 100,000. I think it's almost 150,000 people who are following this account. And I'm sure there are even more who are blessed by these words every single day. Were you surprised by the growth of this site? And I'm just curious if you kind of, what do you make of that? Why are
Hmm.
people responding to your words in this way?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, absolutely surprised for the reasons that you've said. Like when you zoom in with that level of particularity, womanness, blackness, Christianness, like language, and especially, I think in a lot of progressive Christian spaces, there can be a resistance um to written liturgy because there's
Right.
there's something kind of scary about the organization of it, about believing in some kind of authority in it even. And like when I first encountered liturgy, I often would kind of be like, I'll choose my words. I don't want to pray in unison. Like, I want the independence. And I think a lot of that comes from a level of distrust and having, particular voices be suppressed for so long that when you enter a spiritual space and you're being told what to say, it can be really problematic. So I didn't have an imagination for so many people being interested in that kind of spirituality, where I'm using we language, at least in the prayer portion of the post.
Yeah.
I'm using this we language, and it's like, hopefully, people are reading that with a we in mind. So yeah, I didn't have an imagination for it, but in hindsight, um, some of it makes sense to me. The timing where I think a lot of Black Christians, a lot of Black spiritual people were just kind of feeling burnt out and, frankly, afraid to be fully themselves and fully in their pain in evangelical Christian spaces, um, because of, police brutality, because of the election season and all of that. So I think there was something kind of timely that spoke to a longing that people had. Like, maybe I don't feel safe in church right now, but is there a space for me still to encounter the divine, to encounter God in somewhat of a community? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, again, it's been amazing to watch the influence and the growth of that space. And I think just to see, it's interesting because you speak about and you write about like what comes out of anger, but also that what comes out of sadness. And yet, I think there's a quality of beauty and hopefulness that maybe we'll get a chance to talk about in all of
Mhm.
your writing. That's true in these written prayers. It's also very much true in your book. And there's, I guess, an honesty as well as a commitment to. There's an attention and a care that you are giving in all of the writing that you do, and I really appreciate that. And I'm sure people resonate with it. That you know, even if it, I don't know, sparks questions or I'm not sure I do think that or feel that. I think it's hard not to be drawn to the sincerity and honesty and vulnerability and power of the words that you're putting out into the world. So first of all, just thank you for that.
Thank
Before
you.
we get too much into this here flesh, I did want to hear about your own spiritual journey. So you've mentioned being in liturgical spaces in recent years. There's a
Mhm.
scene in the book where you write about visiting a Baptist church for a few months as a middle schooler, and I'm going to quote you. You say it was your first encounter with a spirituality that demanded your death far more often than it ever advocated for your life. So I was
Mhm.
just struck by this picture of a middle schooler who is kind of giggling in the pews with her sister and not quite on board with like the message that's being proclaimed and not there for that long. And now, as a grown woman in a liturgical space, writing prayers for hundreds of thousands of people every day. Like, how did that happen?
Yeah, it's so funny because my sister, who is somewhat of a spiritual person, but certainly wouldn't identify as a Christian. Like we always laugh about kind of my like career trajectory and where I've ended. Like you never would have thought I would go from, that small Baptist church where I did not feel cared for and I felt a lot of confusion. So I'll speak to that. I was a kid. We were kids and um I think people who were born into Christian spaces and like um, evangelical Christian spaces, but I would say the same is true otherwise, but specifically evangelical Christian spaces, like you can kind of be, at least in speaking with my friends, you can kind of become numb to like the strangeness of it, the strangeness of the language and the messages being communicated. And so I wanted to be sure to communicate faith as I first encountered it, which was just terrifying and hilarious and strange I went to this Black Friday service and we have this pastor sweating and like pounding his chest and pretending to jam nails in his hands and it's like I'm a kid and I'm like what is happening, like when we sing that song nothing but the blood of
Mhm.
Jesus and think about an 11-year-old encountering that concept for the first time, like nothing but the blood of this man, like it's grotesque,
Mhm.
it's grotesque, it's strange, and I really think it's good and right to put ourselves back into that space because there are people still in that space of like confusion and terror when they encounter Christian spaces. But yes, so I did not go to that church for long. And really in high school, because of some conversations in an English class, began thinking more about truth and what is truth, which led me to think about religion and God. And I started asking these big questions of, like where are we from? And is there truth and can I know it? And I've always been a skeptic. Anyone in my family always says, Cole was born a skeptic. You were born you came out a skeptic.
Hmm.
And it's true. And so I entered religion with this like the skepticism as kind of a researcher, as good of a researcher as a 17-year-old can be, and I think I just needed to encounter God in a way that made sense to me and made me feel like I was intellectually in control. And so I made it about these books and and like uncovering these different faith traditions, um but really it was I think a path to God for me because I could do it in this kind of contemplative and literary way. There was a lot of bad in it, but there was a lot of good in it. And by the time I went to college, I was like, I'm really interested in Christ. I think, maybe the story of him being divine is a true story, is a story that contains truth. And I started to go to um, this predominantly white, what do you call them? Not a youth group. A youth
Like
group.
a parachurch ministry on
Yeah,
campus
exactly.
ministry, something like that.
Yeah, yes, the language is escaping me. So I started to go to predominantly white campus ministry group and continued to ask questions. And after college, worked for um, a collegiate ministry organization and eventually worked for an Episcopal church
Hmm.
outside of Philly. And that's where I really encountered liturgy for the first time and um, the the kind of the solemn nature of a church service and liturgy, and I was really drawn to it, and have been ever since.
Yeah.
Although I'll say I haven't always felt you know the greatest sense of belonging in those spaces because I'm Black.
Yeah, it's an interesting contrast between, I mean, I'm thinking about the earthiness or like what you can often a more evangelical and less kind of liturgical space is at least characterized as being more about like an intimate or personal and individual relationship with God. And
Mhm.
more liturgical spaces are associated with more of that emphasis on some of the abstract qualities of God, the transcendence, the grandeur, the mystery. And one of the things that I find so interesting about your writing, and this comes up even in the title of your book, is the earthiness and the fleshiness of your understanding, particularly of your Christian faith, not just of who God is, but of Christianity. And I would love to hear you talk a little bit about the title, how you came upon the title, but also the way in which you see the words "this here flesh," which are kind of
Yeah.
coming from somewhere. You can tell us about that, but also obviously linked to an experience even of this like bloody, scary, right, image of God on a cross. So can you just talk about
Yes.
that a bit?
Yeah. So one of my favorite novels of all time is Beloved by Toni Morrison. And there's this scene, or we in the novel, we continue to go back to this space of the clearing, um, where there's this matriarch of all of the people, this black female matriarch, and she's preaching to all of these women and children and the men who are kind of waiting for her at the perimeters of the clearing. And if you read it, I'm not going to do it justice, but it's a really beautiful scene because there's so many unspoken cues and so much embodiment and kind of intuition. But um, the matriarchs the matriarch, baby Suggs, says, you know, children come to the center. And then the children come and she says, you know, let your mothers hear you laugh, and then they laugh, and then she says, women or the men come to the center, you know, let your wives see you dance, or let your children see you dance, and the men dance, and she's like, women come to the center, you know, and cry for the living and the dead, just cry, and the women all participate in this weeping moment. And she says, you know, these different generations all kind of come together and, you know, get tangled up in one another. And the men are weeping and the women are laughing and the children are crying. And it's this emotional, embodied spiritual moment. And they collapse in the grass. And then baby Suggs gives a sermon. And she says, in this here place, we flesh that weeps, laughs, flesh that dances on bare feet in grass, love it. And she goes into this beautiful monologue about the resistance and the necessity of caring for the body, and that being a way to care for the soul. So anyways, I chose this here flesh as a nod to that moment, and knowing that my book was going to be this intergenerational storytelling, and
Mm.
knowing that I want my spirituality to contain some of what baby Suggs was doing in that clearing. I want that for myself, and I want that for my children and my elders to have that kind of spirituality. I thought that that's a good place to start, you know. So
I love it so much. And I read Beloved for the first time when I was in high school in an English class, and it was actually my favorite book that we read. This was junior year English, and so I went on to take an African American literature class in college, really because that was on the syllabus, and I wanted to read it
yes.
again, and I've read it a couple
Wow.
of times since then. And I feel like as a white person coming into Toni Morrison's work in general, maybe Beloved in particular, but maybe just in her work in general, I feel like there's still just many, many layers for me to continue to understand and puzzle through. And I think some of it is, as a Christian, the fleshiness. And I think like that sense of what does it mean to be embodied and to love this body?
Mhm.
And on the one hand, I think there is not a history of hatred related to white bodies, right, in this country. And on the other hand, there can be this like dismissiveness of the body in at least the spirituality that I've been raised with. And so, for different reasons, I think it's also been really important for me to understand what it means to have a body before
Yeah.
God and to be a body. Like, yes, I have a soul, but it's not as though that is in any way separate from my body. And I don't even have language to talk about my soul and body being the same, right? Like being
Mhm.
connected so intimately to one another that I shouldn't even have to talk about them as separate entities. But a lot of your book, I think, is really, and a lot of your work in general, is dealing with this sense of what does it mean to be a spiritual body, an embodied spirit, like these
Mm.
two what we talk about as aspects of our being, but actually being integrally linked to each other. And there's a place where you're writing about some of your own physical struggles, like in your body, and learning how to befriend your body again. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what does it mean to befriend our bodies. You can take that in whatever direction you want, because I think there are lots
Sure.
of ways it could go.
Hmm. Yeah, I if you read the book, you'll hear more about this, but I've struggled with chronic illness for about 5 years now, and recently more acute issues with my eyes and my retinas in particular. Um, and so I explore what that means, what it means to care for and pay attention to a body that's in pain a lot. And I think even if you're not someone who, is chronically ill, struggles with chronic pain, or is in the disability community, there's so much we can learn from I think the disabled and chronically ill community, because they've had to learn um, what it means to survive a culture that really succeeds by us being disconnected from our bodies. We're a lot better at being tools for capitalism, for production, what have you. We're a lot better at that. You make a better tool if you're disconnected from the pain, from the aches, from the joints, from your needs. And I think I can't afford to disconnect in that same way anymore. And I think you're right. I mean, you mentioned, the hatred of white bodies has not been as prominent, in the history of our country, but it's about black bodies, but it has everything to do with white bodies too. And I think something I've been thinking about, especially in the past few months, is what an embodied spirituality could mean for white people, and why the resistance to an embodied faith. And I think, frankly, a lot of it has to do with guilt. And when you have to remember your body, when you, as a white person, when you have to remember your body, and when you have to remember your grandma's body, your great great grandma's body, and the color of her skin, like that's going to do something to you. And I think guilt and shame, especially, is such a driver of what is, motivating people to want to brush quickly over our embodied existence, over the work and the energy of our bodies, because we so much shame is trapped in them. And I can only imagine what that shame would be like for a white person, to have that trapped in your body every day and have to remember that. But there's obviously a lot of beauty in our bodies, and that's part of the sermon that baby Suggs is giving. She's saying, like, yonder, they don't love your neck unnoosed and straight. They don't love that. They don't love your neck unnoosed. You got to love it, like stroke your hand on it. And it's this way of saying, this is inherently in resistance to the ideals of the world and the people that want to use you. So let's reclaim it. They're not going to do it for you. Does that Am I making sense?
So much sense. It
Okay.
just you're just giving me too many questions because I have to decide on one to go with next. No, I'd love to hear. I'm thinking about the sense of the generational connections, because that's some work that you do in this book, particularly about your grandma and your dad. That's really tender and beautiful, and filled with grief. Also, the stories that you tell of your family, and I wonder how you see that in terms of connection to your own body.
Mhm.
And yeah, I think that is one thing that, at least in many of the books I'm reading, right now I've also been reading the love songs of W.E.B. Du Bois, and it's, a novel, but nevertheless it is a story of generations, and of generations of both beauty and trauma.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it was very interesting reading your book alongside that, because there's so many overlaps, both in terms of the beauty of the writing and the storytelling. But I just have been thinking about, in what ways, as a white person, do I connect my body, as you were just saying, to the bodies of those who've gone before? So you don't need to answer that for me, but I'm curious for you. In what ways, do you connect your body to the bodies of those who've gone before you?
Mm. Yeah, I think I haven't always thought about it in the way that I've learned to, but it really, when I went to write this book, was planning on writing just this contemplative, you know, like just contemplative meditations on, lament and rage. And I know, well, for one, my strength as a writer is in storytelling. It's was the spirituality of my household growing up. It was stories. And so I knew that there was some tension there, but I also realized I just was incapable of talking about these concepts without talking about stories. And so, I started and then eventually found I'm incapable of talking about, my story of lament without talking about how it relates to my dad's story of lament. And about, I don't know, a few years ago, had started interviewing people in my family, and my father, my stepmother, my grandma, really just as a family project to continue to try to curate some of our collective story and history, since that hasn't been done for us, or I should say that's a lot of that has been taken from us.
Yeah.
And through that, I realized so many threads in our stories that were connected, that I don't even think my father and my grandmother ever talked about and recognized in themselves these threads um, of shrinking, of expanding, of hunger for connection, and then alienation. And um, there's a ton of research, more and more research coming out about how, previous generations can affect our DNA. Um, and I suspect it's just going to continue to come out. I think even before we had the research, we all have known to a certain extent, these personalities, these fears shape us. We pass down our fears from generation to generation. A child sees what their parent is afraid of, and it's like, you don't know that that spider is scary until you see someone else, like flinch from it. And so I think we've always known it, but now we're having more and more research to help us give language to what's happening. I think trauma can be certainly passed down, traumatic, the effects of trauma. But I also think a lot of beauty can be passed down, and a lot of hope and and habits of hope, and so yeah. In writing this book, I'm uncovering more and more, like how much I've been given, how much I've received from both my father and my grandma.
Well, and that's one of the beautiful things about the book is this. At one point, when I was reflecting on the book, I wanted to call your dad the hero of the book, and he is in many ways. And you even call him a magical hero, I think, at some point. And he's also so very vulnerable and human, right? Like, fallible. That's the word I'm looking for.
Yes.
Like, he is not a perfect person, and he's broken in many ways. And you hold that so well, so that you don't come to the end with any sense of condemnation or of putting him on a pedestal,
Yeah.
and I just, it's really, it's not easy to do that with, characters, whether that's in fiction or nonfiction. And I think that does hold on to both the, really the breadth of our humanity in the beauty and the brokenness that we all embody in some ways, in various ways.
Mhm.
I want to ask a little bit about healing, but before we do, I want to ask one more question that's a little more pertaining to spirituality and race. Early on in the book, you write, it takes time to undo the whiteness of God.
Mhm.
And I was really struck by that sentence, and would love to hear you reflect on what it has meant for you to undo or begin undoing the whiteness of God.
Yeah. I'm glad that you paused at that sentence because I it was a sentence that I thought, should I just take this out?
Mm.
Um, and I'm, so I was raised most of my life in not an inherently religious home. I said it possessed a kind of spirituality, but not a Christian, an overtly Christian spirituality. And somehow in between, that white Baptist church I attended and that predominantly white campus ministry that I attended, at some point, the image of a white God was injected in me. And you would think, you weren't raised with this. You weren't raised with this image. I wasn't even raised thinking about Jesus. So, like, why is this so like stuck in you? And I think once it's in you, it takes time. It's more than me just saying, God is black, God is black. And I in the book I say, even still, after years of trying to deconstruct, and I know that word is difficult for some people, so maybe I shouldn't use deconstruct, but even after years of trying to reclaim my sense of spirituality and who God is, and telling people, person after person, college student after college student, God is not white, God is not white, I still sometimes often think of Jesus as white. What
Mhm.
does that mean? It's like it's a really sinister image that it's difficult to get out of you, especially when so much in art and other things can affirm that, or at least the art that we elevate can affirm that. And
Mm.
so what it's looked like for me is finding a community of belonging that will not let me go, even if will not reject me, I should say, even if I come to different conclusions than them, even if um yeah, a community that gives you the freedom to explore and question and resist, I think it's frankly the path to young people in this time. It's the path to young people who feel so skeptical and so trapped and smothered by Christians telling them what to think and believe about everything, as opposed to letting them experience their belief and experience God and give them time to work out what God means for them. So when my belonging depended on believing in a white God, depended on believing in a God who was indifferent to Black suffering or who didn't center Black suffering or all of these things, my faith and my experience of God was so small. I would say I was barely experiencing God. I was more so experiencing this desire to belong, to fit into these spaces that ultimately didn't love me or care for me.
Mm.
Being in spaces of true belonging that say, regardless of you know um belief you reach, but regardless of what doctrine you come to, like, we need you, and it's this community of mutuality and tenderness. That's how it happens. People say read this book, read that book, and I'm a reader, so I'm never going to say don't do that. But I think more than that, it's like find people who you feel safe to ask questions with, you know?
Mm. That's really interesting, and I love that. I'm thinking because I think it's actually important for different reasons, but for white Christians also to undo the whiteness of God. And um, in all of these conversations, there's a sense of the incarnation of God in Jesus does affirm the ability to find God in people who look like you, whoever you are, right? Like there is some, whether you're white or black, that's not what we're talking about in terms of like undoing the whiteness of God, but in terms of undoing the idea that God is only represented in a physical whiteness, but also all that whiteness has come to represent historically as far as power and even within our culture, like some idea of goodness or beauty or, any of those types of things. And recognizing that, in fact, where the God of the Bible introduces, I mean, in the Psalms, God says, essentially, let me introduce myself. I am the God of the poor and the oppressed
Yeah.
and the widows and the orphans and the strangers, the people who are not Israelites. And you're like, wait, what? That's your calling card, And I think there's so many facets, at least, to what it means to actually understand the vastness of who God is and the mystery, and also that particular intimate experience of a God who knows you as you are. And anyway, I appreciate your willingness to wrestle a little bit with that. It's certainly something I've been wrestling with as well. I've also wrestled with, and I think this also goes back to artwork, but I remember the first time I had the thought that Adam and Eve, whether we think of them as like two individual humans or even in some sort of representative state, were not white. I literally was like, oh, I mean, of course, like even just geographically, that makes absolutely no sense. But I was so like,
Yeah.
what? When I came to that thought. And it's such a good thought exercise in terms of just peeling back my own unspoken assumptions
Yes.
about who belongs, right? And
Mhm.
who is represented and who God sees and who God cares for, which is, again, much farther and wider and broader and deeper than I might even be able
Mm.
to imagine.
Yeah, that's good.
Well, I do want to make sure I get a chance to talk to you a little bit about healing, because you write about woundedness and you write about trauma and you write about pain, but you're also writing about healing. And I'm curious to hear just ways in which you say you have experienced healing and also where there might still be some longing for healing, where healing has not, been kind of neat and tidy or complete.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've experienced a lot of healing well, I'll speak to me personally and then maybe I'll try to apply it to more people, but I personally have experienced a lot of healing in literature and people that have gone before me in novels and fiction. I found so much healing in the imagination of Black people for kinds of healing. Um, and I think that speaks to me because of there's something true about my interior life, about my selfhood, like I am a person who loves literature. So, it makes sense for me to experience healing in that way. I think we're, uh, yeah, I feel like we're in this kind of space a lot, so social media space, where we're trying to find this kind of one size fits all path to healing for so many people. And I don't want to be too hard on it, but I think it really can it can be kind of a lazy form of caring and helping people toward healing, but also it's just not true. And sometimes I just want to I don't have a smartphone. I use my husband's phone. Sometimes I just want to throw his phone and be like, this is not gonna work. Like you can't just take five, not everyone can take 5 deep breaths and feel like and drink a glass of water and feel like they're ready to go. Like it's different for different people. And certainly I think everyone can glean something from like breath and caring for your bodies through water. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying allow your path to healing to be nuanced and to make sense with your true selfhood.
Mm-hmm.
And that requires some interrogation of the self. That requires a lot of interrogation of your interior life to say what desires are in me, what fears are in me, and when have I felt connection? I feel connection in books, encountering these characters or talking to other people about books. And so um if that's the path for me, it's going to be literature, but it might be something else for someone else. I also think you're completely right, this kind of tension of knowing like there's always more healing that can happen and that can lead to really dissatisfied souls if you're expecting to just
Mm.
like be fully healed. Like I I say, I'm moving toward liberation. I want us to move toward healing, move toward liberation, because I'm just really not certain if I'll ever experience a sensation of like full healing. Um, and I think that's okay. And I don't mean that to sound despairing. I just mean that I hope that we as humans can learn to be more acquainted with like the not yet, and the waiting and the fact that we're healing as we're constantly being wounded, and we're healing as we're constantly remembering old wounds that we have forgotten about. My grandma, she's since passed since writing the book, but One of the last conversations we had been talking about healing. We had been talking about each other's stories, and um, she said this that I think will stay with me forever. She might not even remembered what she was saying or known what she was saying, but she's talking about our story. She's talking about my story and like using we and I and you interchangeably. So I didn't even know who exactly she was talking about. And then she just looked at me and said, "We did good. We did good. We took the sweetest part of the fruit and we cut it off."
Wow.
I know. And I walked out of that hospital room, I was like, I looked to my husband and I'm like, did you hear what she said?" And I looked it up because I thought there's no way she just thought of that in that moment, but she did. We did good. We took the sweetest part of the fruit and we cut it off. And so there's so much mystery in those words, but also something very incomplete. Like she didn't say we did our best, she didn't say like we've made it. It wasn't like it wasn't triumphant language of healing. It was just like we did good, we took the sweetest part of the fruit, which means that, that's an acknowledgement that some of that fruit was poison. We didn't take the poison fruit, we took the sweetest part of the fruit and we cut it off. And we said, what does it look like to also behold the beautiful and be able to understand that like your fruit might contain both um, a strangeness and a beauty and a goodness. And so that's wisdom from Phyllis Marie Arthur, not from Cole Riley. But
Well,
I
thank you
definitely have
for
been thinking
passing
about it
it
and
to
holding
us.
it close.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because I've been thinking a lot about the idea that our body can tell us, like, hey, pay attention. Like that ache in your back is actually a signal of the, stress that you're feeling about such and such. Or, there are ways in which we can, if we pay attention to physical hurt, actually get to some emotional and spiritual woundedness and be healed of it. But also, I've
Mhm,
been thinking about chronic pain and that there can be this easy narrative of like, oh, you just haven't paid attention to the
mhm,
wounds that need to be healed in your inner being. And so it's essentially your fault that it hurts. And like, I'm like,
mhm,
okay, and yet I do think there's some measure of there is always pain in the world, and our bodies sometimes reflect that in such a way that it can come up for healing, so to speak. And sometimes we are bearing witness in our very bodies to that which is wrong. And that might be
mhm,
wrong, something that has literally happened to us that is wrong, but it also might be something that is just like wrong in the universe, like wrong in the world, at least for the time being. And carrying pain and acknowledging that and not pretending that it's gotten all better might be a way of saying, yeah, it's not all okay. I
yes.
think even in your book you write about Jesus weeping for Lazarus, and I wrote down this quote too. You said, "If Christ wept for Lazarus, he must have done so not out of an absence of hope or faith, but out of love. It was an honoring. When we
Mhm,
weep for the conditions of this world, we become truth tellers in its defense." And I think about pain sometimes being similar. Like it could be an alert, like, hey, you need to pay attention and do something. But what if it's also sometimes an honoring and a
mhm,
weeping for the conditions of this world that comes out in our bodies? So within all of that, I think you write about the role of sorrow, the role of lament, the role of rage, essentially in healing, like as a part of an honest expression of faith, but also as a part of a necessary pulling back if it's going to be a time to actually allow God into healing. So I'm curious if you could just speak a little bit to, yeah, sorrow, rage, lament, hope, healing, all those things.
mhm. Yeah, I think all of when I think about hope, at least, I think it means that you have an imagination for something different. And whenever we weep, whenever we're angry, I think there's some kind of it's some kind of inherent acknowledgement that you expected or you desired something different, that you had an imagination for
Right.
a different way. I'm angry whenever, someone I don't mean this to sound trite, but it's just an example. I'm angry when someone cuts me off in traffic because I have hope and I have this imagination and expectation that people will, be caring and,
Mm,
tender on the roads or however you want to look at it. But there's something of that emotion that I think is inherently rooted in hope. I mean, despair and violence, those are different. That's when, the lament and the rage kind of flip into something that's degenerative as opposed to something that is leading toward a
mm,
better way or pointing toward a better desire or a more whole desire. So I think they're really important and they're, frightening and all obviously always going to threaten people who hold way too much power and who want us to focus on positivity all of the time. But I try to remind myself as much as possible that, whenever I am giving myself the freedom to experience pain, to name aches, to name my anger, I also can make it, pointed in the direction of hope
mm.
and to claim to use my lament to claim I want more for myself. I thought I say lament um it's not about the world being bad. I think that's what people say. It's like you're just saying the world is all bad. It's about believing that the world is worthy of goodness, that my neighbor is worthy of goodness. That's where the sadness comes from. And if we shift that, I think those emotions can be experienced as a form of hope.
I really appreciated your words along those lines in the book as well. Thank you for sharing that here. And as we come kind of to the end of our time, the last question I wanted to ask you was just the way in which you see a relationship between personal or individual healing and caring for the body and kind of accepting the body's limitations and beauty and goodness and social healing, the work of justice and of activism and bringing that healing into the world. How do you see those things as related to each other?
Hmm. I think that we're reaching a point where we're putting a lot of weight on self-care and self-awareness, which, I think has value. There's the Audre Lorde quote that, people post all the time or share all the time in these talks about self-care being an act of, political resistance
Right.
and it's a beautiful thing. Don't stop sharing that quote. But at the same time, I think we have to reach a point or we have to be inclusive of language of community care as well. There's, sometimes, not sometimes, self care is just never going to be sufficient. Self awareness is never going to be sufficient. I think we were made for a lot more than that. We were
Mm,
made for this kind of communal care, communal attunement, and I can care for myself all I want, but if my neighbor doesn't love me, I'm still going to be wounded and wounded and wounded, and then what am I supposed to do? Take a bubble bath and then the next day like that's not how we're going to get free. That's not the path to liberation. I fully believe we need to have, you know, an imagination for the individual and the collective and to not alienate them from each other, to know that, receiving community care can be a form of self-care and to kind of have those things like um, intermix in a more meaningful way. And then I think that expands out of the community care, out of the individual, the care for of the individual for the individual. We can expand into social healing. We can expand into policies, into infrastructure. But I think that the self care and the collective care, community care, that's where things begin. They're kind of like these groundworks for social imagination in general, at least as I think about it. I'm curious how you think about it.
well, yeah, I do think so. I guess I'll say two things. One, what I'm hearing you say is that actually um, connecting with other humans is in an intimate and loving way, right? Like, is an act of self care. Like, that there's actually not, I mean, we might distinguish them because of the way self care is written about and spoken about, which is take a bubble bath or take your deep breaths or whatever. It's like seen as this solitary endeavor. And not to say it shouldn't be. I think you and I both are people who will take care of ourselves by curling up with a book almost daily. But at the same time, that sense of like, no, you need other people. And that's an aspect of self-care. And when I've also my own experience of, yes, like participation in the work that I believe God is wanting to do through us in the world has almost never been solitary. Like, I'm trying to think of an example. It's like when I've committed to praying with someone else, that I've even had the eyes to see places where I might be able to be involved, or have had the courage to go to a march, or have had the wisdom to talk to my children in a different way about what events we're seeing on the news. I mean, whether it's these very little things within our home or much broader political participation. I also, some of the work I've been doing around healing has been looking at Jesus in the Gospels, and his healing work always is sending people back into their communities with a blessing that involves the idea of shalom. So, the bleeding woman, he says, go in peace. Like, he literally sends her, publicly proclaims her healed so her community can receive her. And then those words that can seem kind of trite to us, go in peace. I mean, he is, as a Jewish man, saying, bring shalom with you where you go. Bring the healing of, the healing dream of God, right, with you as you go back into your community. So I think that there is always a connection for true healing to be taking place. There's always going to be a connection between that self-community and society in an even broader way.
That's beautiful.
Well, Cole, your words are beautiful and powerful. And that is true both in terms of Black Liturgies on Instagram, as well as in your book, This Here Flesh, which I'm just really grateful to have been able to read and talk to you about. So thank you for joining us here today.
Thank you for having me. This has been great.
Thanks so much for listening to Love is Stronger Than Fear. Remember to check the show notes to learn how you can enter for a chance to win a copy of This Here Flesh. And do visit my website. I'd love for you to read an excerpt from my book, To Be Made Well, and check out the gifts that I can send you if you order the book before March 15th when it comes out. And as always, I would love for you to share this episode, subscribe to this podcast, give it a quick rating or review so that more people can benefit from these conversations. Thank you to Jake Hansen for editing, to Amber Beery for doing all of the social media coordination, and thank you to you for listening. As you go into your day today, I hope and pray that you will carry with you the peace that comes from believing that love is stronger than fear.